Judged by the law of England, I know this crime entails upon me the penalty of death. But the history of Ireland explains that crime and justifies it. Thomas Francis Meagher. The Fenian Raids on British America, or as we know it, Canada, did not just occur. It was in a way an extension of the Young Irelander Rebellion in 1848. Now, this was in a larger sense a part of the famous European rebellions of 1848 that brought famous individuals such as Otto von Bismarck in Prussia, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte in France, and Giuseppe Garibaldi of Italy to the forefront of European politics. But also, in the nations the rebellions failed, sending thousands into exile. Many who went to the United States of America, who believed in the same principles of their own causes. No nation had as many exiles as Ireland, not only from the rebellion, but from their potato famine, which had taken brutal effect when the harvest of 1847 was destroyed, better known as Black 47. The Young Irelanders were not only rebelling against what they viewed as a genocidal reaction to the Great Famine, but also to what they had viewed as a 700-year occupation by the British forces dating back to the Norman conquests. The leaders of these rebellions, before perpetrating their own, went to France to congratulate the French government. When returning, one of the leaders, Thomas Francis Meagher, presented a new Irish national flag, a tricolour with the green of Catholics, white symbolizing peace, and orange to represent the Protestant Irish in the north. Their rebellion would unfortunately fail. The leaders would be rounded up by the British authorities and be sentenced to death. Luckily, a petition with over 17,000 signatures from people saved the leaders' lives. They were all sentenced to life in Tasmania, modern-day Australia, which served at the time as a penal colony for the British. Many leaders would find refuge in New York City after their short terms in Tasmania. They still did not give up their dreams of a free Ireland, and many of these leaders started Irish militias, sponsored by the individual American states. Of these, the most famous is the 69th New York State Militia, commanded by Michael Corcoran of County Sligo, and his second in command was in fact the man who gave the modern Irish flag to Ireland, Thomas Francis Meagher of County Waterford. So in 1856, one of the junior officers in the 69th New York named James O'Mahony established an organization known as the Fenian Brotherhood, an organization founded looking for the liberation of Ireland and the establishment of the Irish Republic. O'Mahony's colleague, James Stephens, returned to Ireland in 1858, and on March 17th, he would found the Irish companion organization, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, that would lead to Irish independence in the early 20th century. But in 1861, O'Mahony's was derailed from his plan when Southerners fired on federal troops at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, on April 12, 1861. Immediately volunteers and troops were called on to fight. Thousands of Irish immigrants, north and south, volunteered to fight in the conflict. In 1864, though, towards the end of the war, O'Mahony and his many Irish met in Chicago to officially make the organization a national one. Thousands upon thousands came and joined the Brotherhood. The Civil War would end the next year in 1865. Now, this is where we have a situation where the Irish in America have an edge on the English. There were now over 180,000 combat-trained Irish mustering out of the Union and Confederate armies. Not only combat-trained, but on both sides the Irish regiments had gained such reputations for bravery and gallantry. So in April of 1866, large groups of former Confederate and Union Irish soldiers began to arrive in Maine and Buffalo, New York. The U.S. federal government clearly was aware of what was about to happen, but President Johnson, along with many in the House and Senate of the U.S. Congress, were unhappy that the English played both sides of the war. So they actually began to sell weapons to the Fenians, who were now training on the Canadian border. Finally, in April, O'Mahony and his 700 men raided New Brunswick. The British commander, commanded by Charles Hastings Doyle, immediately deployed a ship with 700 regulars and began to make their way to fight the Irish. When the Irish saw the warship approaching, with the soldiers and the cannons on the ship, they disengaged. This encouraged the Premier of Canada, John A. Macdonald, to push for New Brunswick to formally join Canada. On June 1st, a force of 1,300 Fenians commanded by one John O'Neill were commanded by the Brotherhood Secretary of War, T.W. Sweeney, to conduct a raid and attack into British territory across from Buffalo, New York. Now, the objective of the attacks and raids were not just to terrorize. O'Mahony's main goal was to actually capture Canadian territory and hold it hostage until the British government granted full independence to Ireland. On June 2nd, 1866, O'Neill and his forces met with Canadian militia, the Queen's Own Royal Canadian Rifles, and Royal Hamilton Light Infantry. The Battle of Ridgeway would be a decisive Fenian victory. For one thing, the Canadians were not battle-hardened. O'Neill's force was made up of men who had fought throughout the Civil War, Union Blue, Fenian Green, and Confederate mixed in formation, beating back the British Red. But on June 4th, 400 men of O'Neill's main army was surrounded. Actually, it was on June 2nd. I apologize. It was actually the same day. On June 2nd, 400 men of O'Neill's main army was surrounded by Canadian militia near Fort Erie. But O'Neill was actually returning from Ridgeway, then crushed the encirclement. However, American involvement was now being brought into question, and the Canadian Premier, Macdonald, wired both London and Washington, D.C. Remember, friends, many of the soldiers were in Union uniforms, fighting with Union rifles and artillery. So 5 days after the invasion, Andrew Johnson, President of the United States, declared formal American neutrality. T.W. Sweeney was arrested, but only held for a short term, because at the end of the day, the Americans were fanning the flame. Sweeney would continue to serve in the United States Army until the 1870s. Ulysses Grant and George Meade were sent to Buffalo, where they would command the arrest of 1,300 Fenian forces. Then, after interring them for a few days, released them back into the general population, only after the two generals stripped them of all their weapons. On June 7th, though, Fenian General Samuel Spear with 1,000 men invaded Canada instead, hoping in a last-ditch attempt to seize the territory for the hope of Irish independence. The Canadian forces near Danville, Canada East, would finally put an end to the conflict. Now, small attacks would take place at Quebec and Manitoba in 1870s, but they would not have the same numbers or support as the 1866 raids. The Fenian Brotherhood would finally dissolve in 1880. This was a chance to the Irish independence that many Irish in America believed would work, especially following their experience in the American Civil War. Thanks for watching, friends. Thanks for joining us on this interesting period in post-Civil War America. Please like, share, and comment. And if you're new to the channel, please subscribe. I try to have as much new things up as I can. Again, a hurricane just came through, so I've been a little hectic. I was traveling, but now I'm back, and we're going to get back on these videos. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you real soon.